From the heart of the Low Country in South Carolina,
it's the Take Two podcast, where we take theology to the next level. All right, well, welcome to Take Two, our first podcast. And it's been a while since I've podcasted, and it's been a really long time for you, Zach, right?
About 33 years, so it's been a minute.
Yeah. So Zach approached me. This is in December, I think.
I think so, yeah.
Starting to coach basketball. We've coached basketball for a while, and asked if I thought about what I would think about doing a podcast. And here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah. So why don't you explain maybe to the audience what your thoughts were and what we're doing here?
Yeah. You're exactly right. Asked you during basketball. You were like, I've been thinking about it, itching to get back in the podcast game. Yeah. And we were sitting in a leadership meeting at our church, and I think you came up with a name in 3 seconds. You said Take Two. I was like, and to back up, we kind of wanted to launch off of stuff that Charleston Bible Church, where we go to church,
right?
What we were kind of already doing, maybe using a starting point from a sermon or Sunday school or something, and develop it more, so our people could run with that a little bit, and then anyone listening could follow along as well. So I like the name Take Two. Maybe you can break that down more for us too.
Yeah, well, in you're acting or recording a film or something, you might have two different takes, take one, take two. And so launching off of that idea of, hey, sometimes there are things that we could dive a little deeper into. I had taught a class, I think it was in October.
Oh, yeah. A lot of chatter on this class, a lot of discussion.
On decision-making in the will of God that I largely follow Greg Kokel on. And I only had 2 classes to do it. So there were questions about that. And so that I thought, not that we're going to talk about that today, but that'd be a prime example of, hey, we might need a second take on that just to answer some questions, say some things that I just didn't have time to say. So here we are. And so, and coincidentally, our pastor, our senior elder, just launched into a sermon series on Romans. So we thought, we kind of scrambled to get everything ready.
Kind of scrambled. We've really scrambled. Michael is sweating. He's been running to get over here on time. So
yeah. So today is President's Day, right? Is that what the day is?
Correct. Yeah.
So if all goes well tonight in the editing, this will be available the very next day on Tuesday, the 20th. And but I thought I was going to have a leisurely day today. And turns out a little noise our dryer was making last night took like 4 or 5 hours out of my day. So
I was gonna say your head is a little shinier than normal from maybe some sweat.
I need to dry it off some. But yeah, so I was telling Zach that maybe God's, that we were made to work. God didn't want me to have an easy day, although I wasn't going to do nothing. I did have plans to do.
Yeah, so some of us actually have real jobs that require you to work on President's Day, so not too much sympathy over here.
Yeah. All right. So Romans 1. I guess we should say this before we launch proper into the discussion. In addition to kind of launching off something that might be recently discussed in our second segment, which I think we're going to release on Thursdays. We might just talk about something that's interesting, something that we find interesting, something that maybe someone has asked of recently. And so I think we're going to talk about baptism in the second segment.
Are we? Wow. Yeah, we are. Yeah, that's good. I'm prepared. This is good.
All right, that's good. All right. So with that said, in our first segment, we were wanting to just kind of talk about Romans. And for those of you who don't attend Charleston Bible Church in the lovely city of Charleston, South Carolina, not Charleston, West Virginia, or some other Charleston out there, but Charleston, South Carolina, there is a Charleston Bible Church in West Virginia, and they have one of the URLs. So we love you out there, CBC of West Virginia. So our sermons are available via sermon audio. I'll put that link in the description, so you should be able to get that. And so if you don't go to CBC and you want to hear the fuller message, the take one from Pastor Joel, then you can go there. So I'll start by saying our pastor began with a picture of Mount Everest, and he talked about how long it takes to climb Mount Everest and the acclimation and the exhilaration, but also probably the exhaustion that you have when you finish climbing Mount Everest. And he likened the book of Romans to Mount Everest, and how he's going to spend probably a year in this book, maybe more, shorter than what one of our previous elders spent back in the early 2000s.
Shout out to Jack White, is from what I heard before my time.
Yeah. That's when Jill and I started attending. He was working his way through.
I just remember what part of Romans.
I can't remember where he got. I think he probably got 8, 9, 10. He could probably say.
Because some people I know when they go to a church, they're like, I started coming here in Romans 7, or it's like a marker if you're expository preaching slowly through a book.
Right. Yeah. So the best marker for us is the birth of Caleb.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So we attended that Sunday right after he was born. But okay. So the likeness to the Mount Everest is that it's going to take him a while to get through Romans, and it's going to be worth it. But we might, sometimes you're working through a longer book. You might get tired of it, but the reward pays off. So anything you want to say about the message in general? Or
Man, first off, I think I'm speaking for both of us, so thankful for Pastor Joe. We were kind of talking after the service, what are we going to talk about?
Right.
Because he just hit everything so perfectly. Yeah. And I know I love that analogy to Mount Everest because I'm so excited. I love starting new series, but it can wear on you and take some perseverance to get through. But I know I'm particularly excited, probably as you are too, for Romans. I was just looking up some quotes. He in the sermon brought up, was it Charles Wesley? He was talking about a little bit, and Martin Luther some. But I was going through some theologians and their quotes on Romans that I just think are so good. Martin Luther says, it's worthy not only that every Christian should know it word for word by heart, but that he should occupy himself with it every day as the daily bread of the soul. Just throwing a high esteem on Romans.
Right.
J.I. Packer says that all roads in the Bible lead to Romans, and all views afforded by the Bible are seen most clearly from Romans. And then I really like John Piper. He calls Romans the most important theological Christian work ever written. And so I'm getting like jazzed up when I'm thinking Pastor Joel's going to go through this over a year. Yeah. So all that to say, I'm very excited for it.
Yeah. And part of the things that Joel brought out in his introduction was that Romans largely deals with the question of salvation. And so you're going to see, Paul, like a preview, kind of paint a bad picture first about the sin of the Gentiles, the sin of the Jews. And then I think it's like 3:21, he pivots and starts talking about a righteousness that comes by faith. And so then he'll go from there really up through 5 and 6, talking about salvation. 7, there's a little bit of debate on, is he talking about...
That'll be good.
Yeah. Is he talking about a believer who's struggling with sin or someone who struggles with sin before they're a believer? Do you have a hot take on that?
I don't know if it's a hot take. I think it is a believer wrestling. I don't know. But
yeah, I think it's clear from the passage that it is, a believer, because Paul is talking about himself like in the present, and I can relate to what he's going through.
Exactly.
So.
I think it's perfect.
Yeah. And then so Romans 8, we kind of see this transition. He's talking about, the creation groaning and how we pray and how we can have security in Christ and what Christ wants to do. And then he really kind of starts talking about how does this gospel that seems to be at the present time really trending, going viral, to use a current day phrase, amongst the Gentiles, how does that relate to the Jews? Because the Jews are starting to not adopt it as much. And so 9, 10, 11, he talks about how that all works out. And there might be some verses in those passages, in those chapters, about sovereign grace that that are used in support of that. And it's not really until chapters 12 through 15 that he starts getting a practical use. So it starts applying the doctrine that he's talked about. And then 16, I could be wrong on this, but most of Paul's books, he kind of ends with this epilogue, and it seems like 16 is a longer epilogue.
Very long, yeah.
Than most of them.
Names everywhere.
Yeah.
Shout out to Phoebe, huh?
Phoebe and Julia.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
And Julia,
Yeah. Where is Phoebe? You caught me off guard. Is it in Romans as well?
I think so. Well,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's in Romans. I just associate with the person who delivered Romans, like potentially.
Right,
That's what. So I don't.
Right. Yeah. They did meet in the house of Julia, so that's there. So that's one of my daughter's names. And but one of the books, I don't know if it's Romans. It may be Galatians. I think it's Galatians where he says, "You can see by how big of letters that I'm, basically signing this myself." So. So kind of an overview of Romans.
That's helpful.
And then Joel and he kind of goes over this. These are the notes. We're going to see if we can make these available via sermon audio that he hands out. But basically, this graph Joel went over.
I love that graph because it hits it from several different perspectives to help it stick with you and resonate. And there's certain people like, oh, this helps me just trace it. And I think it's easy. Get lost in a couple verses, but be like, okay, this is where we're at, which Joel does really good with the context.
That's good. Okay. So then Joel kind of dives into 1:1. He talks about Paul. So did you have anything that you wanted to say about Paul specifically?
Well, even one step before that, maybe we can ask the question in light of the overview. Why did Paul write Romans? Because it's kind of like if you're just reading this, you're not seeing this right away, all of it. You don't come across all that till the end. So, why is this the letter that he's taking this massive undertaking of fleshing out the gospel? Like, why is it a little bit different? I don't know if we can answer all of those questions. But I think what Joel pointed out well was that, he's looking ahead to missions to the end of the earth, trying to go to Spain, really. And he's looking at this Roman church, and there's division, Jew and Gentile, and we need some unity if we're going to make that happen. So you have this missions emphasis, and then underneath that, you have this pastoral emphasis where I don't think he talked about this. He talked about this a little bit. Maybe how the church at Rome started was Jews went to Pentecost. They heard Peter preach. Then when they come back home, they start the church in Rome. Probably mostly a Jewish church at its outset because of that. And then Gentiles are layered in. And then sometime, I think it's 49 AD, Claudius, emperor of Rome, expels all the Jews due to some uprising. I think there's some historian, Suetonius, that says something like there was this uprising associated with Christos. Danny mentioned this a few weeks ago too, and I think it's like probably Christos, over Christ. And so Jews, this primarily Jewish church that turned a little Gentile, the Jews were kicked out. It's really becoming a Gentile church.
Right.
5 years later, Nero takes over. This edict has expired, and then Jews can come back in. And what they find is a church that looks nothing like probably what they left. All these customs are gone. So there's a lot of tension, probably as you can expect, if two cultures are kind of coming together. So underneath all of this, he's saying, hey, the best way to address this is the gospel to the Jew and the Greek, saying these phrases over and over and over and over again. And I think having that in your mind helps you appreciate it a little bit better and see, wow, there's a lot going on at the church in Rome. And I think that helps us understand it maybe a little bit better too.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to, that was on my mind that we should mention that because one thing that Joel mentioned was, in one sense, he's like, this is my gospel. This is, this is what I believe. And when I get there to Rome, I'd like y'all almost maybe to help send me to Spain. Like, so if you believe this, like if this is the truth, not that he would have to ask those things, but that he's saying, like, here's the gospel. Here's what I want to do. I want to go on to Spain as well.
And he had never been to Rome before, obviously, right? By the way, he's writing this.
Right.
And so that probably explains why this, to me, this looks like a long introduction compared to the other epistles, or like grace and peace to you, Paul, servant. But this is like a little bit more substantial. So that makes sense too.
Yeah. Another hot take.
Ooh, love hot takes. We're in the kitchen.
That's right.
We're cooking up some hot takes.
Right. So there's debates. There's difference of opinions on, when we get to the end of Acts and we see Paul is imprisoned in Rome, because he eventually does get to Rome. So he writes this in Corinth, right?
I think so, around like 59, 57 or something.
Right. And he's on his way to Jerusalem with the offering.
Yeah.
And so we know that once he gets to Jerusalem, he's arrested. There's a threat against his life. He's taken up to Caesarea Philippi, right?
I think so.
Yeah. And then he's held there for a couple of years. He eventually he appeals to Caesar because they were going to just turn him over to the Jews. And so then the question here's kind of the background.
Okay, yeah.
So do you think that Paul is released from that initial imprisonment and then makes it to Spain and then returns and then is imprisoned a second time under Nero and then executed? Or do you think that he's executed right then? Because there's different
that's
takes.
a good
and
question.
Not that it really matters, but
it matters, Michael. No, I'm just kidding. No, this is good. This is why Take Two is so good, because we've got the brilliant Michael Mott with his master's in apologetics and philosophy, and I'm like, man, I honestly haven't thought that through, and I don't even know what tradition points to or anything like that. But I love it. I want to learn more about that.
Sure,
that's a good thing to kind of dive into.
Yeah.
But what's your view?
I think he probably was released. I say that only because it seems like, what happened to Luke? We don't know. Like, Acts just ends and we don't really, get. But I think traditions, a lot of historians would say that he was released and went to Spain and then came back.
I might be just making stuff up too. Did some people say he may have made it as far as England? Am I making this up?
Well, that's what Joel said.
Okay, that's what's in my mind.
Some traditions say that he made it as far as England. That was the first I heard of that
I'm
Sunday.
not familiar.
So I would be speaking from ignorance there. Yeah. I just don't know enough to say. And as you said, my strength is not history; it's more of the philosophical side of stuff. So, okay, so Paul. Anything we want to say about Paul himself?
Here it says he was called to be an apostle, and I've heard you talk about yourself as an apostle many times. So maybe you want to explain that? No.
Yeah. Well, he does. So let me open up the
Great.
word.
Let's get into
it. Let's open up Romans, because he does say a phrase. He turns a phrase here that I think can be beneficial. If I can find it. Okay. In verse 5, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles. So apostle just means a sent out one. And if you read Galatians, Paul makes it pretty clear that he was sent out by Jesus himself. He wasn't sent out by a man, nor was he sent out through the means of men, but he was sent out by Jesus. And so there are a few men who were sent out personally by Jesus. And so we would give them the capital A office of apostle. And then we could say anyone who is kind of sent out in general would be like a lowercase apostle. So there are a few folks who we might not think of as having the office of apostle who get that word associated with them, but that doesn't mean that they are speaking from the authority and the office of a capital A apostle. Is that
that's great, because people throw around apostle all the time at some of these places. You wonder, like, really? Yeah. That's good. Capital A, lowercase a, very helpful.
Yeah. So we'd put Paul as a capital A apostle, and then Michael as a lowercase a apostle.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. Anything else about Paul himself? Bondservant.
Yeah, that might be a good thing. What were the three here? Apostle, bondservant, and set apart.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. That's a lot. That might even be great for like a separate, like really you can give that 30-second overview, because it has a lot of connotations today.
Right. I think the Greek word is doulos.
Doulos. Yeah.
And so while for a while, that was just simply translated servant. And then there was this big push that we should translate it as slave. NASB is bond servant. And I think part of the problem with translating it as slave is that, especially in America, we fought a civil war over slavery. That word slave has connotations that may or may not be correctly associated with this word and how slaves in Rome were viewed and used. Although there were some atrocities against folks too. So,
what was the figure? I don't remember this. What Joel threw out? What the amount of slaves there were?
He said that the population of Rome was 1 million, and that probably a majority were slaves. But then he threw out 50%, which would be half. So the mathematician in me, I was like, I just wrote down around 52%.
Yeah, so for those who are keeping track who don't know Michael, he's the apologist, philosopher, and mathematician, engineer. We'll keep adding as you follow along.
Right. So I was like, well, it can't be, if it's exactly 50%, then it's half. So probably, but I'm guessing around half of them were slaves. And then he said that while some of those slaves would have held positions like a teacher or a doctor, prominent positions, most would have been what we would maybe think of as a indentured servant, where they're doing menial tasks around the house. They could be mistreated. They were seen as property. And so, but most of those slaves came from conquests. Like, we're going to go take over this place, and we're going to take your military age guys and maybe some gals along and back and, support us. And then what I thought was odd was about 3,000 or 300, about 3,000 poor citizens, if I wrote that right. It had to be, maybe it was 300K. You had to go back and listen to the sermon audio. But there were a large number of people who were citizens, and they felt like they were above working.
Oh, right. Yeah.
But so they were sustained. They weren't like in the Senate or anything like that, and so they were sustained through taxes and stuff. And then they try to keep them appeased by like having, all the things that would happen in the Colosseum and stuff like that. So,
very good. Covered Paul. What I should have. I'm very unprepared. Don't have my notes from the sermon.
Do you want to look at my notes?
Oh, right in the middle. This is great. So you feel like we covered Paul. Okay, I guess set apart for the gospel of God. We might want to touch on that. Was an application.
Yeah. Whenever I think about Paul being set apart, so here's another facet. Of my love of the Lord of the Rings.
Okay, I'm telling you, Michael. Lord of the Rings talk. Lord of the Rings. I'm bringing in Patriots talk in a negative way. This is your one. Now, this is your one free pass. Go ahead, Lord of the Rings. It is
so. There's this council at Elrond, and Frodo volunteers to take the ring, and some of the wise people were like, he has no idea what he's volunteering for. And when Paul is struck blind on the road to Damascus, and God is talking to, I think it's Ananias.
It's something like that. I'm honestly, you said Frodo and I zoned out, but keep going. It's riveting.
He said, this Paul guy's going to come to you. You're going to heal his blindness. And he's like, what's going on? This guy's been torturing people. And he says, I will show him all that he must endure for the gospel. That's a loose quote. And so we see early on that Paul is set apart for the gospel, and he doesn't know everything that he's going to have to endure. He's kind of naive on it. And so he has this task that's put on him. And in the same way, I think, in a similar way, not to the same degree, but in the same way, all of us who are believers have a calling. We are set apart. We have certain gifts, certain personalities, certain spheres of influence, so that we have a role to play in the kingdom, just like Paul did. Now, obviously, Paul's capital A apostle different than ours. So
No, I like that a lot. He gave this analogy of Abraham Lincoln that was pretty profound, and maybe I'm thinking of my life. I'm probably not going to be president of the United States, but hey,
you never know.
It's crazy things are happening.
That's right.
So, but that's good. Yeah. What are you set apart to do? I think that goes along with that previously discussed hot topic, this adult discipleship class.
Yeah.
You learn about, finding your will, what God has
Right,
for you. So that
right.
might be a good thing to pull apart down the road.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great intro to that kind of stuff. Transition to, you can say the fancy Greek words behind.
Oh, okay. For what Clayton asked about?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So in the midst of us saying like, we don't know exactly what we're going to be talking about, because Joel did such a great job of pulling it apart. He did mention the Nicene Creed because, well, let's just read those verses and then why he might mention the Nicene Creed. So he was set apart for the gospel, and then starting verse 2, which God promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his Son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who was declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ our Lord. And so here we see like Jesus, Paul's going to give Jesus' fleshly and his divine kind of natures. And so he is born of David's line and kind of declared the Son of God through his resurrection. And in other places, we'll see this term only begotten. It may be translated one and only in some places, or simply only son. But Joel referred to the Nicene Creed, and in there it says, "And in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only Son of God, begotten from the Father before all ages, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not made." And so it goes on. So the question was, how are we to understand this phrase, only begotten?
Because when I think of begotten, like just naturally, I think of, the genealogy. So-and-so begets so-and-so and so-and-so. And so I think human procreation kind of thing. So I think this is a very good question.
Yeah, and I think the word in its ordinary sense just means born, or some have translated as made, but I think that's the wrong, or because they were talking, I was listening to a couple articles on the way here, and one of the distinctions was, it's not made, it's born. And
right, yeah,
and it could mean a unique position as well, like a unique relationship from there. And so, was it? Do you have the C.S. Lewis quote there?
I've got it in 2 seconds. If you want to keep talking about something else, I can come back to.
Yeah. So the thing that C.S. Lewis basically says, he's bringing it down kind of on our level, and he's making the distinction between being born and being made. So you want to read what he says?
Yes, he says, when you beget something of the same kind as yourself. A man begets human babies, a beaver begets little beavers, and a bird begets eggs, which turn into little birds. But when you make something of a different kind from yourself. A bird makes a nest, a beaver builds a dam, a man makes a wireless set.
Yeah, and so then they're joking about what a wireless set was, because we don't have those, but well, not by that name, anyways. And so I think that we could naturally say that Jesus is born of the Father, but now we had to qualify it, because we'll say he's eternally born of the Father, he's eternally begotten of the Father. William Lane Craig uses this illustration, not to prove a point, but to demonstrate a point, that if you had a bowling ball that was set on a cushion for all eternity, you would see that effect for all eternity, even though it wasn't in time. The bowling ball would still have made a depression in that chair. It would just be an eternal depression. And so in the same way, he would say that Jesus is eternally generated from the Father, or begotten of the Father, because then the Spirit is eternally generated from the Father and the Son. So Jesus has a unique role in I don't want to say creation, in existence, because he's the only one who is the son of the Father, but he's not made, and he wasn't born in time. He's eternally begotten from the Father. Anything you want to add?
No, I think you nailed it, because growing up, I was confused a lot between, if Jesus is God's one and only son, I'm a son of God. How is that different? Right. And I think that precise language, eternally begotten, is good, because it speaks. I mean, you nailed it. And I think I was going to pull it up, but I think in Hebrews, like Isaac is referred to as only begotten son too. And if we know our history, you're like, wait a second, there's a couple of sons there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the Ishmael, and then does Abraham go on to have more kids from other people, or is it just Ishmael and Isaac?
It's a great question. I'm going to make this up and say, feel like there's,
make it up.
I feel
make it up.
Don't check me on this. I feel like there might be more kids thrown in there that we just don't, alluded to, but what do I know?
Yeah. It seems like that too. We'll you can fact check it and comment on it.
Yeah, this is great. Yeah, engagement.
But so we know that Abraham had Ishmael, but Isaac is the one and only. Legally, I think that's true, because he cast Ishmael out so that he wouldn't have an inheritance. So we know that, in a biological sense, Ishmael was his son. But from a legal standpoint, it was only Isaac. And then, of course, Isaac was the only one who held that special covenant relationship. So he was the promised son, and it was through him that the Abrahamic covenant was going to be fulfilled. So.
Now, and then I have a follow-up question, or maybe I could ask, what are some go-to texts on the deity of Christ? If you're looking for a text, you're like, man, these are just good ones to know, even you don't memorize. Like, I can pull my Bible out and get to these quickly and easily.
Yeah, I would say the opening verses of the first chapter of John, where John says, in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. And I actually have that here, so it's crazy that you asked that. He was in the beginning with God. And then verse 3 says, all things came into being through him. And I appreciate John saying this, because he says it both positively and negatively. So and then he'll say, apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. So I think this is a great passage, especially if you're dealing with a Jehovah's Witness who may be using a different translation, because they're going to start saying was a God.
Yeah.
And so, but they didn't, and I don't know why, they didn't change verse 3 at all. So verse 3 says that all things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has come into being. So if you had a Venn diagram, you might say all the things that came into being, all the things that didn't come into being. And if Jesus brought all of these things into being that has come into being, then Jesus can't be in this set. Yeah. He has to be over here in this set. And so if he is in this set of never having come into being, well, the only thing that we can think of that would go in there would be God. And so this, I think, strongly speaks of his divinity. Colossians 1 is another great passage where it talks about in him the fullness of deity dwelled, and it was through that he was able to reconcile us to himself through his blood on the cross. And so
we should talk about Colossians 1 too, because it throws in this word, he's the firstborn. I think that's a good one. Jehovah's Witness are like, hey, he was born.
Right.
It kind of similar to begotten, but a little bit different language.
Right. So firstborn, we know the story of Jacob and Esau. And Esau sells his birthright for a bowl of soup. Hopefully it was a really good bowl of soup.
Dude, it better have been good. Same thing with even the fruit. It's like, come on.
Yeah.
What are we doing?
Yeah. So there is a special place that the firstborn has, because they are the inheritor of basically symbolically all that their father has. And we know that they get a double portion over any other son who inherits. And Esau sold that. And so for Jesus to be the firstborn of all creation, he is the inheritor. He holds that special role. It doesn't mean that he was physically born, at least in his divine nature. He was in his human nature, clearly. But it says all the fullness of deity dwelled. Another passage, I think it's the second chapter of Philippians, where it says that he had the very nature or the very form of God. And for us, that's not very strong language, but for Greek, when we talk about the form or the essence of something, they mean the exact essence of it, and that you are shaped by the essence of that. So we would say, if he has the form of God, then he is the God. We might use the form like, hey, there's a form. We put Jell-O in it, and it makes, but that's not the form that they're talking about. They're talking about like a nature or essence. And then I think Hebrews 1:3 and all through Hebrews, Jesus is going to be compared to Moses, angels, the law, the Levitical priesthood, and being shown to be greater. So those are good passages.
And that's easy to remember. John 1, Colossians 1, Hebrews 1. You can kind of associate that, and those are great go-to. And then you wrestle with the begotten and the firstborn, kind of understand that helps out a lot. Because why is it even important that Jesus was 100% God, 100% man? Like, what's the big deal? Yeah, so John Piper would make the point that if he's not God, then his blood can't atone for us. Maybe you could make an argument that one perfect man could atone for one other fallen person. Right. But we think the Bible says that all sins of, and I guess we could say all those who will believe, if you're limited atonement or a particular atonement, but basically all, multiple sins are laid on Jesus. He has paid the price for many, many people, all the whole world in one sense. And he can only do that because God the Father is able to pour out his wrath in a way that is able to satisfy his wrath for many people. And so if he's not God, if he's not divine, then, he wouldn't be able to do that. Romans, we'll talk about later, Paul's going to compare the headship of Adam versus the headship of Jesus. And so we can fall underneath the federal headship of Jesus and be brought to life, whereas we were in death for Adam. So anything you want to add there? I again, nailed it, because that's like, it is so important. You're like, begotten, firstborn, what's the big deal? It's kind of semantics, but it's really not semantics. It's integral to everything we believe. So thanks for breaking that down. I don't know if I've got too much more about this. Anything else you want to hit before we close it out? Yeah,
I think, just to kind of read over the applications that Joel had. So he wanted us all to read through Romans this week.
Let's do it now. Just start reading.
There was a time, I think it was 2 summers ago, that I read through Romans every day for a month.
You are a super Christian, Michael.
Yeah, so
that's good for you.
Were you part of that?
I did not participate. Okay. I did read. I was like, I'll read Romans. I read Romans multiple times. I didn't read it every day because I'm not as good of a Christian as Michael.
Well, I think what I ended up doing was maybe like I started going like 1 through 8 on one day, 9 through 16 on another day, just to kind of, because maybe for a week, it's like, it's so much, but read through Romans, memorize Romans 1:16 through 17. Have you got that yet, Zach?
I'm just trying to get multiple versions, so I can do ESV,
Okay, all right. And then what is your calling? We already talked this a little bit, like what have you been set apart to do? Obviously, Paul was set apart for that. And then could you give a well-reasoned answer from Scripture that Jesus is God in the flesh and defend his humanity and deity? Man, we kind of talked to
John 1 just like nailed it. That's like the easiest, I think. Yeah. Awesome.
All right. Well, take 2.
Episode 1 in the books.
Episode 1. All right. And so, segment 1.
Segment 1. There you go. Yeah.
And so I guess it will be a second episode. Yeah. So we will record that later. We're about to go to a men's Bible study.
And then back at it.
And then we'll be back at it. We're talking about baptism. So for you, should be Thursday. Look forward to show up.
Love it. Thanks for listening to Take 2. Find us wherever you find podcasts and on YouTube for those who want to watch our video cast.